The most effective objection to this kind of argument in the past has been this: something does not exist simply because we conceive of it existing. And that's true. For example, we can conceive of the most perfect elf existing, and it does not follow that this elf really exists. But why do we know that? We know that because we can also conceive of this elf not really existing. After all, if we couldn't, we would have to concede that it does really exist by rational necessity. But in fact, we can conceive of just about anything, either existing or not existing, in some places, at some times, or in some way, just as long as that thing is finite. But if there is any kind of being that cannot be conceived to not be, then that principle does not apply in such a case. That kind of being would be different. And this ontological argument is different than most others. Most others start with the concept of this being, and then claim that this being must really exist because we have a concept of it in our minds, which is not true. But this formulation of the argument works in the opposite direction. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. God's existence is not established because we can have a concept of His existence. It is established because we cannot not have a concept of His existence. In other words, God is the being that cannot not be conceived. We always conceive of God existing, and we never conceive of Him not existing. If there is any being that cannot be thought to not exist, then it must exist. To deny this, one would have to contradict himself by claiming that he is able to conceive of what he admits cannot be conceived. For this reason, there is no greater proof for the existence of anything than if we are not able to conceive of its non-existence. Now, even though I think my future videos will deal with this objection more thoroughly, I will try to touch on it here. Depending on how one wishes to define the word God, this objection can have many forms, but the most common form is that the being proved by this argument is not a personal being. All this argument proves, they say, is that some kind of infinite being exists, but this being might just be an unconscious being, one that is entirely impersonal and dead. In response to this, it is enough to point out that personality, consciousness, knowledge, life, these are all kinds of being. That is, they are things that exist. And we cannot deny this. For instance, if I deny that personality exists, I prove that at least one person exists, the one denying the existence of personality. The same is true of consciousness, knowledge, and life. Denying their existence is proving their existence, and whatever exists is a kind of being. On the other hand, the opposites of these things cannot be understood as a kind of being. Impersonality, unconsciousness, ignorance, death, these things do not exist in and of themselves. They are merely deficiencies of other things that do exist, namely personality, consciousness, knowledge, and life. Just like darkness is not a thing in itself, but is merely the absence of something else, light. Anything that exists merely by virtue of being absent of something else is not a kind of being. It's a kind of non-being. It's not a perfection, it's a deficiency. And the greatest conceivable being cannot be conceived to consist of any non-being, like impersonality, unconsciousness, and these kinds of things. Infinite pure being cannot be conceived to in any way be deficient of being. Remember, premise 1 says that non-being cannot be, and that being cannot not be. But if we say that that being which must exist is not personal, then what we are saying is that a kind of non-being, impersonality, is what must exist, and that a kind of true being, personality, might not exist, which contradicts premise 1. But we know different, just like we know that darkness does not exist anywhere, and cannot exist because it is not a kind of being. Even so, we know that impersonality does not exist anywhere, and cannot exist because it is not a kind of being. But personality is a kind of being, and true being cannot not be. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being is also the greatest conceivable form of all being. It is the greatest conceivable personality. It is the greatest conceivable consciousness. It is the greatest conceivable knowledge. It is the greatest conceivable life. Anything that is true being, and not merely a deficiency of being, must be conceived to eternally and infinitely be in the greatest being conceivable.